The jungle steamed like a furnace that August morning in 1945. Cicadas screamed over the sound of boots squelching through wet soil. A line of Japanese nurses, mud splattered, trembling, uniforms shredded, were herded down a narrow trail somewhere outside Manila. The war was over, but no one had told their bodies yet. Every breath still felt like the last one before execution. Rainwater mixed with sweat on their faces as American soldiers barked orders behind them. Rifles raised more for show than safety. 15,000 Japanese women had served in the Pacific as medics, clerks, or nurses. Most expected capture to mean interrogation or labor. None imagined humiliation. One of them, Lieutenant Eiko Nakamura, carried a blood-stained satchel with morphine vials that no longer mattered. She had spent 3 years patching up wounded men who'd once sworn they'd die before surrendering. Now she was the one surrendering, under a flag she didn't even understand. An American MP spat in the dirt. "Keep moving," he snapped. The sound of his accent felt alien, mechanical. The women stumbled onward, barefoot, into a clearing where floodlights buzzed above a wired perimeter, a camp without a name. Inside, dogs barked not wild, but trained to intimidate. The smell hit first. Diesel, mold, something like rot. One soldier laughed, "You're guests of freedom now." The irony stung sharper than rain. Later accounts estimate hundreds of women captured after the fall of Manila were marched like this: no rest, no food, no dignity. For many, surrender wasn't survival. It was transformation into something unrecognizable. One nurse whispered in her diary, "They looked at us like we weren't human anymore." That line, later found decades after, summarized what followed better than any military report ever could. As the women passed through the camp gate, an eerie silence fell. No orders now, just stares. American soldiers exchanged smirks as one of them muttered, "Orders from up top. Keep 'em in line." No one asked what that meant. They would find out soon enough. The gate clanged shut behind them like a verdict, echoing through the trees. Eiko glanced back at the jungle, her last glimpse of freedom before the wire swallowed her whole. Ahead, dim lights flickered over muddy huts. Somewhere inside, a whistle blew for evening assembly. That's where the real breaking would begin. Night bled into morning without mercy. The prisoners were ordered out again barefoot, wrists bound with fraying rope, guards shouting for pace. Mud clung to their ankles like a curse. The monsoon sky hung low, swollen and gray, while the jungle path turned into a trench of filth. For the American escorts, it was routine. For the captured Japanese nurses, it was ritual humiliation. Each step a lesson in defeat. They called it transfer, but the women knew it as the march of shame. Every stumble brought laughter from behind. An officer kicked over a tin bowl one woman had tried to keep. It rolled into the mud, filling with brown water. The prisoners weren't soldiers anymore. They were props in someone else's victory. Reports indicate that across the Pacific, more than 1 in 4 Japanese POW died under Allied captivity. Disease, exhaustion, or simply the slow erasure of hope. Those statistics were later filed under logistics, just numbers in archives, but for these women, each statistic had a name, a face, a heartbeat. Private Miller, a guard barely 20 years old, kept his gaze low. Orders from up top. He muttered when another sergeant forced a nurse to kneel and drink from a puddle. He didn't look again. In war, conscience was a liability. The women said nothing. Even silence had become a punishable act. Rain beat harder. The line of prisoners wound past burn. Doubt trucks and cratered ground, still reeking of gunpowder. Somewhere a dog barked, a sound that would later twist into memory and command. One nurse collapsed. Another tried to lift her, only to be shoved down by the butt of a rifle. The mud swallowed them both for a moment. Hours later, when the barbed wire appeared through the haze, it didn't look like a camp hit, looked like an end. Floodlights buzzed overhead, skeletal watchtowers leaning like vultures. Inside, canvas tents sagged under rain, and wooden posts jutted from the ground like gravestones. The soldiers halted the line. "Welcome to Camp Echo," the sergeant called out, sarcasm cutting through the downpour. The women didn't respond. Their eyes, hollow yet alive, reflected the lights back like mirrors. Beyond the gate, the air smelled of rust, wet hay, and diesel smoke. Eiko Nakamura tightened her grip on her satchel, unaware that the nightmare inside those fences would redefine what cruelty could mean. Camp Echo wasn't on any official map. It sat carved out of jungle rot and rusted wire, a place meant to be forgotten. The prisoners were herded in single file through a wooden gate that screamed on its hinges. Floodlights buzzed overhead, cutting through mist that smelled of kerosene and damp bamboo. Eiko Nakamura looked up for one moment beyond the lights, nothing but darkness. Behind her, the gate slammed shut like a gunshot. The camp's barracks were nothing more than bamboo cages covered with tar paper. Rain leaked through every seam. Rats ran across the rafters, fat from stealing the women's rations. Dinner that night was a dented metal bowl filled with watery stew, if you could call it that. The smell was sour, and the meat stringy, probably horse or something worse. Later records estimated prisoners here were given less than 1,200 calories a day. Malnutrition was not a side effect. It was a method. The American guards patrolled with lanterns swinging, their shadows stretching long across the mud. To them, this was routine. One guard laughed, tossing a crust of bread to the ground just to watch two prisoners fight over it. Another said, "They fear us, but we fear their silence." It was true there was something unnerving about women who wouldn't cry out. Eiko kept her back straight, even when hunger made her dizzy. She counted breaths to stay awake. Every few minutes, a dog barked near the perimeter, yanking its chain until it choked itself. The sound merged with the hiss of rain and the whir of insects. Camp Echo was a symphony of misery, composed to break the mind before the body. On the second morning, the guards brought the women into the yard. The ground was slick, the air heavy. An officer with mirrored sunglasses paced in front of them. "Breakfast," he said flatly, then pointed to a row of metal trays on the ground. No tables, no benches, just mud. No one understood what he meant until he gave the order that would stain the memory of this place forever. On all fours. The soldiers smirked, boots crunching the dirt. The women hesitated, but hesitation here was rebellion. The guards stepped forward, rifles angled low. Somewhere in the line, Nakamura's breath caught in her throat. The humiliation was about to begin. The rain had stopped, but the mud still clung to their knees. The women stood frozen, eyes darting toward the trays of food dumped into the dirt. The American sergeant, cigarette hanging from his mouth, repeated the command in a tone that left no doubt. On all fours. He tapped his boot twice, impatient, while a nearby soldier flicked his lighter and grinned. This wasn't about food. It was about obedience. One by one, the nurses lowered themselves to the ground, their uniforms already torn, stuck to their skin. The smell of diesel, wet earth, and rotting grain wrapped around them. Eiko Nakamura hesitated, staring at the muddy stew that reflected her own face. Behind her, a rifle butt scraped the ground. A warning. She exhaled and went down on her hands. Psychological warfare manuals later declassified described humiliation as an effective method for complete compliance. The logic was simple: break dignity, control the spirit. In Camp Echo, this theory became daily ritual. Every morning, The women were ordered to crawl, to eat without lifting their heads, while guards watched like spectators at a grotesque show. Some laughed, others just stared, stone-faced, as if ashamed to witness what they'd become part of. Private Miller couldn't look for long. It wasn't food anymore. He'd write years later in his notebook, it was obedience. He turned his head as the women licked rice off metal trays, their hair hanging like curtains over hollow cheeks. The dogs barked louder, sensing dominance in the air. A few guards joined in, tossing scraps onto the mud. It was cruelty disguised as discipline, and everyone knew it. One nurse, Nakamura, lifted her eyes without moving her head. The sergeant noticed instantly. Down, he barked. She didn't flinch. That defiance, small as a breath, cracked the performance. For a split second, the camp went silent, just rain dripping from the tin roofs, just the sound of one heartbeat refusing to surrender. That night, she was dragged from the hut. The others heard the gate creak, then shut again. No one spoke. The next morning, her tray remained untouched. In Camp Echo, silence could be survival or rebellion. And Nakamura had chosen the latter. They locked her in a bamboo cage barely wider than her shoulders. The walls were slick with condensation, the floor packed dirt that turned to mush when it rained. Nakamura sat curled, arms around her knees, the world outside reduced to shadows and echoing footsteps. A single lantern swung from a hook just beyond reach, its light cutting through slats like broken sunlight. Her breath rose and fell in slow rhythm, counting time because time was all she had left. The midday heat in the Philippines could climb above 104 degrees Fahrenheit. In that humidity, dehydration wasn't gradual, it was execution disguised as neglect. Reports later showed that prisoners left in such disciplinary cages rarely survived beyond 3 days. But Nakamura wasn't ordinary. Her will had become its own kind of rebellion. She refused to look away whenever a guard passed. Private Miller was assigned to stand watch that night. He pretended to check his rifle, but really he was trying not to meet her eyes. She wouldn't look away, he'd later write. Even when we threatened her, even when we kicked the cage, she just stared back, like she was seeing through us. The stare unnerved him more than any weapon could. By morning, flies had gathered. Her lips were cracked, but she was still upright. The guards took bets on how long she'd last. Someone poured a canteen of water just out of reach, laughing when it soaked the dirt. Another guard whispered, "That one thinks she's still an officer." They didn't understand that dignity could survive where flesh couldn't. When the storm came that afternoon, the camp filled with steam. Rain hit the tin roofs in hammering sheets. Miller slipped away from the watchtower, his mind racing. He couldn't erase the image of her eyes, dark, unblinking, unbroken. That night, guilt crept in like fever. He would later write, "That look followed me every time I closed my eyes." As thunder cracked over the camp, Nakamura's stare burned through the rain. She had no words, no strength left, but something inside her refused to drown. And somewhere, in the guard hut by the gate, Miller made a decision that would risk his career, and maybe save what little humanity he had left. The rain had eased into a slow drip when Private James Miller opened his journal under the dim light of a guard shack. The cover was damp, its pages warped from humidity. He'd started writing months earlier to stay sane, but after Nakamura's defiance, every word turned into confession. He wrote about orders, about laughter that didn't sound human anymore, about the feeling that the war hadn't ended at all. It had just changed its uniform. "There's a difference," he scrawled, "between victory and cruelty. We crossed it somewhere out here." The ink bled as he wrote, the words melting into the paper like guilt refusing to dry. Across the Pacific, there were more than 93,000 Allied guards stationed at POW camps. Many were young, barely men, tasked with controlling prisoners they didn't understand. Years later, hundreds would report recurring nightmares, guilt, and what modern medicine calls moral injury. But in 1945, those words didn't exist. There was only the silence after an order. That night, Miller's silence broke. He watched Nakamura through the rain, still caged, still alive. Something cracked inside him. An ache not of pity, but of recognition. He realized the same machine that crushed her had started to crush him too. She had been stripped of humanity. He had been stripped of conscience. Both were prisoners now, bound by different chains. He slipped into the mess tent when the others were sleeping. Among the rations, beans, corned beef, bread so hard it could break a tooth, he found a single apple. Red, bruised, small. He pocketed it, palms sweating. It wasn't rebellion yet, just a question. Can one act of decency survive this place? Later, by the cage, he crouched behind the rain barrel. The camp was silent except for the creak of wet wood and distant thunder. He rolled the apple across the dirt toward her. It stopped just short of her reach. She stared at it, then at him. No words, no movement. Just two people trapped in a war neither had chosen. Miller turned away, heart pounding, not knowing if he'd just saved his soul or doomed it. The apple lay there, shining faintly under the lantern light, waiting for morning. When dawn crawled over Camp Echo, the rain had turned the ground into a mirror. The apple still lay there, half sunk in mud, its red now dull to gray under the morning haze. Nakamura hadn't touched it. Her hands rested in her lap, thin and trembling, as if she was guarding the idea of food more than the fruit itself. Around her, the camp began to wake the clang of metal trays, the bark of orders, the constant chorus of dogs straining at their chains. Private Miller walked his usual patrol, eyes fixed anywhere but the cage. The night before felt like a dream he wasn't ready to own. Every few seconds, he expected someone to shout to expose him, but no one noticed. The other guards were busy laughing, complaining about rations, joking about home. Miller knew they'd hang him for fraternization if they ever found out. Kindness was contraband. Inside the cage, Nakamura watched the apple without blinking. Hunger gnawed at her ribs, but something in her refused to eat it. Not out of pride, but clarity. If she accepted it, it meant she owed something to her captor. If she refused, it meant she still had a choice. That small, invisible choice became her last weapon. By late afternoon, the sun broke through, steaming the camp into a haze of sweat and stench. Miller returned, pretending to check the perimeter. The apple was gone. For a heartbeat, hope flickered, then he saw it, still there, but crushed under her heel. She had stepped on it deliberately. Juice and mud mixed into a smear on the ground. Their eyes met through the slats. No anger, no gratitude, just understanding. Across the Pacific, malnutrition in female POW camps reached over 80%, with many women suffering permanent damage from starvation. But here, in this patch of jungle, one act of defiance outweighed statistics. Nakamura's crushed apple said everything her silence couldn't. You can control my body, not my will. That night, word spread quietly among the women. The nurse in the cage had refused the food of her captor. Whispers moved through the barracks like wind through bamboo. For the first time in weeks, some of them lifted their heads while eating. Small rebellions, invisible but contagious. And somewhere beyond the wire, that ripple of courage was about to find its allies. By the third week, Camp Echo had settled into its cruel rhythm: roll call, humiliation, silence, sleep. Yet beneath that machinery of control, something fragile began to move. A network of hidden kindness took root in shadows. It started small, a Filipino kitchen boy sliding scraps of rice under the wire, a guard leaving a canteen slightly uncapped, A whisper passed between prisoners when the searchlights turned away. Acts so small they could vanish in a heartbeat. But in a place built to erase humanity, they meant everything. The Filipinos working in the camp knew what hunger looked like. They'd lived under occupation, too. One girl, barely 16, smuggled boiled cassava in her apron. If caught, she would have been beaten or worse. Yet every night she left 2 handfuls by the fence and vanished before dawn. No names were exchanged, just nods, brief and wordless, the universal language of survival. Among the guards, Miller wasn't alone. A corporal from Texas occasionally loosened the women's bindings before inspections. Another soldier kept watch, while Miller pretended to repair the floodlight, buying a few stolen minutes for Nakamura to stand upright. It wasn't rebellion, it was penance. Later investigations revealed that dozens of American personnel were court-martialed for unauthorized fraternization across the Pacific. Most had simply tried to help. One diary entry read, "They tell us kindness helps the enemy. Maybe that's what makes us human." But compassion in Camp Echo was a dangerous currency. Rumors began to spread up the chain of command. An officer complained that discipline was slipping. Orders arrived within days: tighten control, eliminate sympathy. The warning was clear: mercy would be treated as betrayal. Still, the network persisted. Prisoners passed stolen food through hollow bamboo poles. Guards pretended not to see. When Nakamura was finally released from the cage, her first step was unsteady, but her eyes, those unbreakable eyes, burned with quiet gratitude. She didn't smile, but she didn't have to. Everyone in that yard felt it. A pulse of something alive beneath the decay. At dusk, as the sun bled red behind the wire, a low whistle echoed across the camp, a signal to share, to survive, to stay human. But that fragile thread of mercy was about to snap, because someone had been watching. The next morning broke with the sound of boots and barking. Something had shifted in the air. Tighter, sharper, dangerous. The hidden kindness network had been exposed. A Filipino worker was caught near the fence with a sack of rice. He didn't even get a chance to explain. The camp commander dragged him into the yard and announced that the entire population of Camp Echo will learn what happens when rules are mocked. The prisoners were lined up under the floodlights, still half asleep, mud soaking their bare feet. Nakamura stood near the front, her eyes tracing the commander's shadow as it fell across the ground. He raised a clipboard and began to read names, 48 of them. One by one, the women were pulled forward. The guards rolled out metal trays and dumped the slop they called breakfast. Then came the order that froze even the wind. Eat on your hands and knees. Gasps rippled through the line. Someone cried out. Another tried to stand, only to be shoved down with a rifle butt. Nakamura didn't move this time. She'd learned silence was her only armor. The dogs were unleashed just far enough to lunge without biting. Their teeth flashed under the floodlights as the guards jeered, shouting for the women to crawl faster. Reports from Post or Archives estimate 3 women collapsed during this disciplinary demonstration. One of them never woke up. Her name, unknown to history, was written in a guard's logbook, only as Subject 3. The commander called it restoration of order. The men laughed, lit cigarettes, and turned away as medics dragged the bodies aside. Private Miller stood at the edge of the yard, fists clenched. His notebook stayed empty that night. There were no words for what he saw. He wrote only one line later. We called it discipline. It was madness. When the punishment ended, the camp fell into a silence heavier than the heat. The surviving women huddled in the mud, trembling, eyes glazed. Somewhere behind them, a flashbulb popped. A medic, secretly taking a photo through his coat pocket. The image would disappear for years, hidden inside a Bible. As the commander walked away, boots splashing through puddles of rain and filth, Miller glanced at the medic's hand. He didn't know it yet, but that single forbidden photograph would one day unravel the silence Camp Echo was built on. The flash was brief, so fast it could have been lightning. No one noticed except Private Miller, who saw the medic's coat twitch and the faint reflection in a puddle. One click, one stolen moment of truth, captured inside a Bible's hollowed pages. The medic's name was Corporal Harlan Price. He'd been stationed in the Pacific for 6 months, stitching bullet wounds by day, stitching conscience by night. That single photograph would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside that frame, 48 women knelt in mud. Floodlights carved their silhouettes against darkness. Dogs strained at leashes. Guards laughed. The commander stood like a conductor of humiliation. Every pixel of that image, though the word didn't exist, yet held a moral fracture. After the punishment, Price slipped back into the infirmary. He washed blood from his hands, the red water spiraling down a metal drain. Truth has a smell, he muttered in his notes, like blood and rain. He hid the camera inside a supply crate, then later tucked the film between pages of his Bible, right behind the Book of Lamentations. Officially, Camp Echo didn't exist. No coordinates, no records. Only a few coded telegrams mentioned a temporary holding site. But in that hidden roll of film, the place lived. Ugly, undeniable. Decades later, historians would confirm only 6 verified POW photos from that region. Price's image was one of them. When the war ended weeks later, soldiers torched documents and burned supplies. Price refused to burn his Bible. He carried it home like a secret disease. In 1947, during a veterans meeting in Kansas City, he tried to talk about it. Nobody wanted to listen. The world wanted heroes, not witnesses. Miller saw him one last time before discharge. They didn't speak about the camp. They didn't have to. The guilt was written on both faces. We kept the proof. Miller would later say in an interview, "But proof means nothing when everyone's blind." As Price boarded the ship back to the States, he clutched the Bible to his chest, heart pounding with a truth too heavy for one man to carry. He didn't know that one day, in a courtroom half a world away, that photo would resurface and drag their ghosts into the light. Tokyo, 1946. The courtroom smelled of ink, sweat, and burnt paper. Ceiling fans creaked above rows of uniforms and translators, each word crawling across the air like slow thunder. Behind a pane of glass sat 2 men in khaki, former guards of Camp Echo, now defendants at the Allied War Crimes Tribunal. The rest of the camp, its women, its ghosts, existed only in whispers until the Bible was opened. The photograph slid across the table under white light. A murmur rippled through the hall. Even without captions, the image spoke for itself. Japanese women, forced to crawl and eat like dogs while soldiers watched. For the first time, the humiliation had a face. The prosecutor called it a crime of dignity, not of death. The defense called it discipline under stress. The audience called it unwatchable. Reports indicate only 2 guards were sentenced, one to hard labor, one to 10 years confinement. The commander claimed he was following orders and was acquitted. Price's name never appeared in the transcript. His photo was labeled anonymous evidence. The women in the picture, 48 blurred figures, remained unidentified. History turned them into silhouettes. When Miller read the verdict from a newspaper in Missouri, his hands shook. No one talked about the women. He wrote in his notebook, "We punished the men for cruelty, but not the silence that allowed it." Across the ocean, Japan was rebuilding, burying memories as fast as rubble. The public wanted to forget, to rebuild a nation from ashes, not shame. But not everyone could move on. Among the crowd that day in Tokyo sat a young American journalist named Ellen Davis. She watched the trial with a reporter's detachment until that photo appeared. The image burned itself into her mind. She later wrote in her dispatch, "We documented atrocities, but we never documented empathy. When the gavel fell, it sounded more like a lid closing on history." The men were led away, the photo sealed in an evidence folder, and the courtroom emptied into rain. Outside, Ellen Davis lit a cigarette and whispered to herself, who were they? It was the question no one in that room wanted answered, and she decided, then and there, that she would find out. Rain clung to the windows of a cheap Okinawa guest house as Ellen Davis typed with trembling fingers. The year was 1947, barely months after the Tokyo trials ended, but her mind couldn't leave that single blurred photograph, the one showing Japanese women in mud, crawling like animals while soldiers stood over them. The official record called it evidence closed. Ellen called it unfinished business. She'd arrived in post-war Japan under the pretense of writing about reconstruction. Streets still smelled of ash and diesel. Children played among ruins that once were homes, but Ellen wasn't chasing stories of rebuilding. She was chasing ghosts. She carried a folded copy of that photo in her notebook, the corners smudged from constant handling. Every day she showed it to survivors, nurses, and war widows, repeating the same question. Do you know them? Most shook their heads. Some turned away. One old man at a Red Cross center finally whispered, "You look for the women who never came home." That line haunted her for days. Reports estimate that fewer than 60 Japanese female POW survived Allied captivity by 1950. Ellen wanted to find one. Her search led her through archives filled with dust and denial. She found fragments, medical ledgers, hospital rosters, handwritten notes in Japanese script. One file caught her eye. Subject N, female, former nurse, Camp Echo. The name beside it, Lieutenant Eiko Nakamura. The trail that everyone else ignored had just lit up. Ellen took a train through shattered cities, watching landscapes scarred by firebombs roll past. Every station felt like a reminder of what had been erased. In her journal, she wrote, "I expected to find villains and victims. Instead, I keep finding silence." One retired Japanese officer told her, "Shame kills slower than bullets." He was right. The women who had lived through humiliation had learned to vanish in plain sight. Ellen finally reached a coastal town in Okinawa where an old mission hospital still stood, its windows boarded, its roof sagging. Locals said a nurse lived there alone, silent, unhealed. Ellen's pulse quickened. She knew the name before they even said it. Lieutenant Nakamura was alive, but survival wasn't the same as living. And when Ellen stepped through the creaking doorway of that hospital, she realized the story she was chasing might break her too. The hospital stood like a skeleton against the sea. Salt wind rattled broken shutters, carrying the faint clang of metal beds left to rust. Ellen Davis stepped through the doorway, the floorboards groaning under her boots. The sign above the entrance had lost half its letters, but one remained, a nurse. Inside, the air smelled of iodine and dust, a ghost of what healing once meant. A nurse in her 70s met her, cautious but curious. "You're looking for Nakamura?" she asked in slow English. Ellen nodded. The woman pointed down a dim corridor. "She doesn't speak much. She just exists." Ellen followed the sound of soft footsteps until she reached a small room at the end. There, by a cracked window, sat Lieutenant Eiko Nakamura. Thin, motionless, her hair streaked silver, though she couldn't have been more than her mid-30s. She was folding gauze, endless strips of white stacked neatly on her lap. Lieutenant Nakamura, Ellen's voice barely carried. The woman turned, eyes calm but distant, as if she'd been expecting this visitor all along. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Ellen took out the photograph, the one from Camp Echo, and placed it on the table between them. Nakamura didn't flinch. Her gaze drifted to the corner of the photo, where her younger self knelt in the mud, unbowed. She traced it gently with one finger. Psychiatrists decades later would label this silence post-traumatic mutism. In 1950, too, it had no name. Reports suggest 1 in 4 former POW suffered lasting trauma, but no study measured humiliation. "She still eats sitting upright," the old nurse whispered, "never on the floor, not once." Ellen asked softly, "Do you remember that day?" Nakamura nodded once, then turned her face to the window. Outside, waves crashed against the rocks like clockwork, each one a memory refusing to fade. She whispered her first words in years. "They wanted to make us crawl. We learned to stand inside." Ellen didn't write for hours. She just sat with her, watching the tide move like breath. The story she had come to find was no longer about cruelty. It was about endurance. But when she finally tried to publish it, the world wasn't ready, because some governments feared that reopening wounds might undo peace itself. Tokyo, 1963. Ellen Davis sat in a government archive basement, air thick with mildew and bureaucracy. Metal drawers lined the walls, each filled with paper that history had tried to forget. She had spent over a decade chasing Nakamura's truth, only to watch it vanish behind rubber stamps marked classified. The file she wanted, Camp Echo, POW treatment record, had been stamped again, this time with something colder, suppressed for morale reasons. She leaned back in her chair, the fluorescent lights humming above her. Outside, Japan was rebuilding neon signs, new cars, American pop songs, but beneath that glitter, silence still ruled. The story of the women who crawled in the mud had been buried deeper than the graves of the fallen. When Ellen demanded answers, an official told her plainly, "Both sides have reputations to protect." He smiled as he said it, like peace itself depended on forgetting. Later research revealed over 40,000 POW files sealed until the 1990s records that could have changed the way the world saw mercy and power. Back in Okinawa, Nakamura's hospital had closed. The building was left to rot, the sea reclaiming its walls. Locals said she'd moved inland, living quietly, tending to orphans, refusing interviews. She never married, never sought recognition. To her, truth didn't need headlines, it needed memory. Ellen wrote her manuscript anyway, titled The Women Who Wouldn't Bow. It was raw, relentless, and human. But when she sent it to her publisher, weeks passed without reply. Then came the letter: "While compelling, your story risks inflaming old wounds. We must decline. No explanation, no discussion. Just silence in a different form." She boxed up her notes, the photo, and her typewriter ribbons, labeling it personal. Do not discard. Before leaving Japan, she mailed one copy to an archive in Geneva, hoping time would do what politics wouldn't. Years later, historians would call this period the decade of denial, a generation that rebuilt on top of unspoken pain. Ellen, older now, would tell a student interviewer, "We lost our honor twice, once in war, once in silence. But history never stays buried forever." In a small Tokyo apartment, decades later, someone else would open a forgotten box, and with it, reopen everything the world had tried to erase. Tokyo, present day. Fluorescent light flickers over a small museum room inside Yushikan, the war memorial tucked behind the trees of Yasukuni Shrine. A young woman, late 20s, black hair tied back, stands frozen in front of a single black and white photograph mounted under glass. In it, Japanese women kneel in the mud under floodlights, soldiers watching from the shadows. The caption reads only, Camp Echo, circa 1945. Donated anonymously, her name is Hana Nakamura, granddaughter of Lieutenant Eiko Nakamura. She'd never heard the story, never even known her grandmother was a POW. Growing up, the woman she called Obuchan was quiet, kind, always feeding stray cats, always refusing to eat sitting on the floor. Only now did those small habits make sense. Hana's hands trembled as she leaned closer to the glass. The photo was cracked along one edge, but the face in the center was unmistakable Eiko's eyes, unbroken even in defeat. The museum curator noticed her expression and said softly, "That image was rediscovered in a box donated from Geneva in the late 1990s. We still don't know who took it." Online archives show that since its exhibition, over 1.2 million visitors have viewed the photograph, many leaving offerings of flowers beneath it. The image became viral decades after the war ended, a digital resurrection of memory. For many, it symbolized not vengeance, but endurance. Hana whispered she survived by standing inside. The phrase had been passed down without context, like a family riddle. Now it fit. The cruelty hadn't defined her grandmother, it had revealed her. When Hana later stood before a group of students visiting the exhibit, she didn't speak about nations or blame. She spoke about choice, about the power of small acts, one apple, one photograph, one refusal to bow. Her voice didn't tremble when she said, "They made them eat like dogs, but they never broke." That evening, as the museum lights dimmed, Hana pressed her palm to the glass one last time. The reflection staring back wasn't just her face. It was Eiko's too, overlapping across generations. In that shared silence, history finally exhaled. The story had waited 80 years to be seen, and now it was free.